One line can change everything. We're now looking at the contrast between two presidents who were each defined by one line they spoke. First of all, we've got the incumbent Bush. And you'll remember in my last inaugural election address analysis, that's a bit of a mouthful to say, isn't it? I need some kind of acronym. I said there was one line that would come back to bite him. But to be honest, it didn't look like that was going to happen in the lead up to this particular election campaign. There had just been an American military success in the Gulf War. Bush's approval rating was at 89%. That's unheard of in the bipartisan nature of politics that we often experience nowadays. Also, the economy was performing really strongly. So when it came time for the Democratic Party to choose a challenger, they didn't really necessarily fancy their chances. So some of the top high-end candidates end up electing not to go ahead in the primaries. So we had a little bit of a contest between some of the more outside names. And one of those outside names is a young governor from Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who eventually secures the nomination. And by the time Clinton secures the nomination, two interesting things have come to play. The first is that the economy has actually started to stagnate. Now, the economy isn't in a bad situation, but relatively, subjectively, it feels like it is because it's gone from a higher level down to a low level. And so the public are starting to perceive that the economic situation isn't so good. Then we have the wild card. This is the last presidential election, actually one of the few presidential elections ever, where there is a realistic third-party candidate. We have Texas billionaire Ross Perot enters this race. And this really kind of puts a wasp's nest in the whole situation. You now have this three-way contest. You have this unknown dynamic. Well, is Ross Perot, is he going to steal more conservative votes? Is he going to steal more liberal votes? Is he going to steal a little bit from both? You've got this slowing economy. So this election suddenly becomes a lot more open and unexpected and unpredictable than it initially looked going into this campaign. There are two things that really hurt Bush in this campaign. And actually, it probably wasn't the third-party candidacy of Ross Perot. You might remember in the last analysis video, I said there was a line that would come to haunt Bush. One of his campaign pledges was, read my lips, no new taxes. Well, we know how this story ends up, don't we? Bush had to introduce new taxes. And the Democratic campaign ran attack ads playing this clip over and over. Read my lips, no new taxes. Read my lips, no new taxes. So that was the first thing that really hurt Bush. The second thing that hurt him was linked to this. There was a presidential debate, and this presidential debate had all three candidates. Again, the last time that this has happened. And during this debate, there was a question that was asked about, well, how has the changes to the economy, how has the cost of living affected you personally? And at this point in the debate, Bush was caught looking at his watch. And it was seen as this really out of touch gesture and symbolic that Bush didn't really understand the public plight. Whereas when Clinton came to answer the question, he walked right to the front of the stage, he addressed the person who asked the question personally by name, and he gave this really warm, emotive answer. So these two factors really hurt Bush's campaign, and that's ultimately what contributed to Clinton eventually winning the presidency. However, Clinton wins the presidency, but he doesn't win the people. Clinton secured the presidency with 43% of the vote. It's the second lowest winning total ever in history, in US presidential history. Now, normally when a president gets voted in, there's normally about half the country that hasn't voted for them. Even some of the landslide elections are normally only won with 60% of the vote. So when you're coming in to deliver that inauguration speech, you recognize that you're addressing a significant portion of the country that didn't vote for you. Now with Bush, this is even more of the case because actually there are more people who didn't vote for him. They voted for the incumbent president, and they also voted for the third party candidate. They voted for something outside of the traditional established parties. So what you're seeing here is a population that isn't fully behind the president who's coming up to deliver the inauguration speech. So this is one dynamic that Clinton has to think about when he's doing this speech. And the second dynamic that's coming into play is that a lot of the Cold War rhetoric that built up so many of these inauguration speeches that we've looked at, well, that's now gone. There is no big bad demon to talk about. There is no axis of evil that you can center and pin your speech around. And so many of these speeches that we looked at, some of these memorable speeches, the Dwight Eisenhowers, the JFKs, they were centered around we are the forces of good and freedom fighting against the forces of communism and tyranny. Well, that's now no longer the case. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The Cold War is over. So what is the new dynamic that you therefore build into these inauguration speeches? These are the challenges that Clinton has to face when he's coming up to the podium. Now, the footage that we're going to be looking at here, this is provided by CBS News. I'd like to thank them for the use of this footage. I do not claim the rights to this footage. The use of this footage is for educational and informational purposes only. Now, the Clintons had an experience in law, so I want to make sure that I'm dotting my I's and crossing the T's when it comes to the legal qualifiers. And with those out of the way, let's now look at our first post-Cold War US president.
My fellow citizens, today we celebrate the mystery of American renewal. This ceremony is held in the depth of winter, but by the words we speak and the faces we show the world, we force the spring. A spring.
You'll know that I've critiqued many presidential inaugurations for starting with a lot of ceremonial fluff, and sometimes it's the first couple minutes of their speech. I'd like to thank the Chief Justice, I'd like to thank the President, I'd like to thank the Vice President, I'd like to thank Congress, I'd like to thank you, the American people. And it doesn't start with a lot of momentum. But what we're seeing here from Clinton is his opening line is all about transformation. It's all about coming from the winter into the spring. And this is a strong start because that's ultimately what you want to be promising as a leader. As a leader, if you're not promising change, then what in all God's earth are you promising? So this is a fantastic start, pulling the audience in with a hook, starting with that momentum rather than wasting that initial momentum with a lot of ceremonial fluff.
Not change for change's sake, but change to preserve America's ideals, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Though we march to the music of our time, our mission is timeless.
That's a cute little line there. Flipping things on its head, using part of one phrase to introduce another phrase. Although we march to the music of our time, our mission is timeless. And there we're seeing a nice juxtaposition between the present and the future. And if you've watched these inauguration analyses before, you'll know that this is one of the key themes that comes up again and again. You've got to talk about what's happening now, and you've also got to project to where are we going from here. And that line contains that juxtaposition of going, okay, this is what the present situation looks like here, and this is where our future is going.
Each generation of Americans must define what it means to be an American. On behalf of our nation, I salute my predecessor, President Bush, for his half-century of service to America.
So here we're seeing the platitudes, right? Here we're seeing the more kind of ceremonial stuff. And this is okay. We're 1 minute 20 into the speech. And this is what I've said in previous analyses. It's okay if you want to do this a little bit of acknowledgement, a little bit of ceremony, but set your stall out first. Clinton has been spending the first 60 seconds or so building a vision of transformation, setting out a stall for change. So he is building that momentum. And once he's built that momentum and he's set that scene for himself, then it's okay to transition into a little bit of the ceremonial stuff, the little bit more of the magnanimous stuff. That's okay. And that's what you've got to remember in your speeches as well, because you're not going to be delivering an inauguration speech necessarily, but often we're delivering a speech at some kind of function or some kind of event where there are people you want to pay attention to, and there are some airs and graces you want to observe. But don't begin your speech with that. Build your speech, build the momentum, and then introduce the ceremonial stuff a little bit later once you've set out that initial stall.
Today, a generation raised in the shadows of the Cold War assumes new responsibilities in a world warmed by the sunshine of freedom, but
That's a lovely juxtaposition there. And remember, I talked about in the introduction to this video, this is the first post-Cold War inauguration speech. So all of that rhetoric and frankly, all of that kind of prepared material that was essentially already given to you by having this big bad enemy to contrast yourself with, well, that's now gone. So Clinton's got to think about what can he do instead. So here we have this hopeful message. So here we have an idea of old world, new world. Again, this is a theme that comes up a lot in these inauguration speeches. But for the first time, the old world is actually describing the Cold War. The Cold War is in the past rather than being something in the present. And using this lovely language of the shadows of the Cold War, dark and cold, moving into a sunshine warmed by freedom, light, heat. It's this lovely contrast that he's portraying in the use of language, and also creating that theme of old world versus new world that defines any great leadership speech and any great presidential inauguration speech.
the sights and sounds of this ceremony are broadcast instantaneously to billions around the world. Communications and commerce are global. Investment is mobile. Technology is almost...
That's cute. We've got a little rhyme. Now, rhyme is a technique that often isn't employed that much in speaking. Now, it is employed very much in a certain kind of performance. You often hear it in singing, poetry, and of course, hip hop, which is singing and poetry combined, really. But it's not a technique we see so much in speeches. But what the rhyme does is it activates a little bit of dopamine in our brain. We go ding, ding, ding. We go, oh, that's cute. Those words rhyme. And we pay more attention because we hear that similarity of sound. So if you have a message that you want your audience to pay more attention to, you want to pique their attention spike, using rhyme can be a way to do this. So it's not often employed technique. I think we have seen it in one inauguration speech in the past before. I can't quite remember. If I had to guess, I think it was maybe Eisenhower used it. So we're talking about a president from 40 years ago was using this technique in their speech. So it's not commonly employed technique, but if you can work it in naturally, it is one that's effective.
Profound and powerful forces are shaking and remaking our world.
So we see it again there, right? Shaking and remaking. So those two examples, they're about 25 seconds apart. So creating this little bit of rhyme, this is allowing Clinton to hold the audience's attention in this moment. He's 3 minutes into his inauguration speech. And what you can find is that you're now starting to lose the attention that is there in the beginning of a speech. In those first couple minutes, people's attention is at their highest. They're right, okay, yeah, okay, something coming new. This is what we've been waiting for all day. We've been waiting for the president to come up and do their speech. And when you're doing your speeches, you have that short attention window where the audience's attention is peaked, and then it starts to go downhill from that point on. So any techniques that you can use to win back that attention is going to allow more of your speech to stick with the audience. And that's what Clinton is doing here. He's bringing in a little bit of rhyme just as we're seeing that dip in attention to bring the audience back into his speech.
need dramatic change from time to time. Well, my fellow Americans, this is our time. Let us embrace it.
This is our time. It sounds passionate, it sounds convicted, it sounds enthusiastic, doesn't it? And this is a critique that I've leveled against other presidents in their speeches in the past, that when they were saying something, the energy wasn't really there. What we can see from Clinton as a speaker is the energy is generally there in his speaking. He is a high energy speaker. He is someone who we would label as having that charisma, this nebulous term that doesn't really mean anything. And it's not to say that you have to be this like pumped up motivational yeehaw speaker in order to deliver an effective speech. This isn't the case at all. But when you are saying something that needs that energy, that needs that conviction, you've got to sound like it. If you are a fairly level speaker, you're quite thoughtful, you're quite reflective, and you get to a point where you say, this is our time. It doesn't really have that punch and pizzazz, so you need to put that energy through it. This is our time. So it's not about sounding like that all of the time, because when you underline everything, you underline nothing. But knowing when to inject that pace, when to inject that force into your speech is really important. And this is a great example where Clinton knows this is where I need to put that little bit extra rev in the motor and make sure this line comes out really strong and firm. And it does come out strong and firm and gets a little acknowledgement from the audience with some applause as a result.
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Again, we see a nice little juxtaposition there. This is almost somewhat resonant of the Kennedy classic, the, if you really want to know, antipomody. Don't worry about knowing the official terminology. I just call it switcheroony. It's not a perfect example of that, but is a juxtaposition. It's going, okay, it's acknowledging struggles, challenges, flaws. And that's something that's important to do as a leader. You can't have this Pollyanna head in the sky approach and say, oh, nothing is wrong, because people know that's not sincere and they don't buy into it. You need acknowledgement of where the problems and challenges are. But it's your job as the leader to lead people out of those challenges and solutions. And then that's what Clinton juxtaposes here. Okay, we've got some challenges and some struggles, but there is nothing that is stopping us from overcoming those challenges and struggles. We already have the skills, the ability, the ethos, the culture that can help us overcome those. Let's start bringing those together and make that happen. So we've kind of got a weighing of the scales going on here. That yes, there's some challenges and struggles, but the challenges and struggles aren't weighing us down. We have what it takes to tip the scales in the other direction.
We must provide for our nation the way a family provides for its children.
There we've got an example of an analogy. Whenever you're talking about big picture concepts, and sometimes things that can be a little bit abstract. So we're talking about the government. Well, what does the government do for people? Well, there's lots of different things that are involved, and it takes a long time to explain and lay that out. So how do you summarize that in something that people can picture really clearly? Well, an analogy is a way that you make the big picture abstract into something that's more everyday and concrete. We provide as a nation in a way that a family provides for their children. You go, oh, okay, right, yeah, I get that. Because when you're looking after children, you have lots of different responsibilities, right? You've got to look after their health, make sure they're fed, make sure that they've got all their, vaccinations and stuff like that. Then you've got to prepare for their education. Okay, you've got to make sure that they're doing well at school, that they're staying on top of their homework. And then you've also got to look at the relationship aspect. You're like, am I developing trust? Am I developing a connection with my children? Am I helping them facilitate growing their social skills with their peers, being part of the community? So there's all these different responsibilities you've got to juggle as a parent looking after children. Or it's the same as a nation looking after all of the different aspects: housing, healthcare, education, security, foreign policy, trade. So that analogy allows people to understand and capture in one line what the government is trying to do and what their vision is. So using an analogy helps to break down for your audience big picture abstract concepts into everyday understandable concrete concepts.
We must do what America does best: offer more opportunity to all and demand more responsibility from all.
This, I would say, is a great example of challenging leadership. So leadership is about pushing the people who you are leading and getting them to perform at their peak levels. It's getting them to contribute to the overall mission. As a leader, it's not your responsibility to do everything yourself. The responsibility of you as a leader is to bring people together and get the most out of them. And we see that in this line here, where Clinton is saying, okay, we're going to do what we can, my job as a leader and our job as a government, we're going to do what we can to offer more opportunity to people, to create the environment to get the most out of them. But we're also going to challenge people. We're also going to push them and say, let's see the responsibility from you to step up as well. And that's what great leaders are able to do. They're able to work out, well, how do we challenge, motivate, and push people to get the most out of them? Leadership is not just about saying, I have all the answers. Leadership is not just about saying, I'm going to do everything for you. Leadership is about saying, here is the path that you can take. Are you going to take this path along with me and along with the rest of the movement?
This beautiful capital, like every capital since the dawn of civilization, is often a place of intrigue and calculation. Powerful people maneuver for position and worry endlessly about who is in and who is out, who is up and who is down, forgetting those people whose toil and sweat sends us here and pays our way.
I just wanted to run that extended bit of clip because that, I think, is a great example of Clinton's gestures here. And again, this is a critique that I've leveled at presidents in the past, and I think a lot of that is a period critique of the time of speaking, where the time of speaking, it was just kind of you stand at the podium and you read some notes, and that's what constituted a speech. What we're starting to see is a little bit more of that modern approach to speaking, where it's like, okay, it's not just about standing and reading notes. There's a performance aspect to this as well. There's an expressive aspect to this as well. And I think this is the best example I've seen of gestures so far in any presidential speech so far. We've got a real widening of those gestures. We've got a variety of gestures, all contained within this small period of time. And you can see as Clinton has that expressiveness in his gestures, the expressiveness of the words is coming through as well. And it's building that bit of conviction in that statement of, we're here to serve the people who put us here. And it gets that applause. And the way that it gets that applause is he's built the energy in the speaking, not just through his voice, but also through his body as well. When I talk about gestures, it's not about gestures for gestures' sake. It's, oh, you need to do gestures because that's a public speaking technique. It's understanding how gestures fit into the larger picture of what you're trying to achieve with your speaking. And this is a fantastic example of how those gestures supplement the words and content that Clinton is delivering right here. Fantastic example. Best example I've seen of body language in any presidential speech so far. Great job, and the audience loved it as well.
Let us resolve to make our government a place for what Franklin Roosevelt called bold, persistent experimentation, a government for our tomorrows, not our yesterdays. Let us give this capital back to the people to whom it belongs.
Again, we see this lovely building of the crescendo. This is a skill that Clinton's really executing well in this speaking. You can see those subsequent lines. He builds the energy, builds the strength, even builds the pace a little bit, having the gestures coming through. So you can see this linear nature of the speaking. And this is a way that you pull the audience's attention in, is you have these peaks. Now, if you bold everything, if you do all your speech loud and shouting, and that's how it is all the time, it gets really irritating and hard and repetitive for the audience. You can't flatline your speeches. You have to have the variation in your speeches. And these peaks are when you pull the audience's attention in. When do you need those peaks to happen? When do you need the audience's attention focused on your speech the most? That's when you need to build that movement in your speech. And there's lots of different techniques in which to do this. And what we're seeing here is one technique of using the voice to build that crescendo, building the volume, building the strength, even building the speed, and having that little bit of gesture coming in as well to really put the cherry on the icing of the cake.
There is no longer a clear division between what is foreign and what is domestic. The world economy, the world environment, the world AIDS crisis, the world arms race, they affect us all.
We're seeing the repetition there to demonstrate a point. In the time period we're in now, we're starting to see that merging of foreign and domestic. The world is a lot more interconnected. And the simple way to demonstrate that is Bush lists off a bunch of different challenges, a bunch of different concepts, and just by repeating world, 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 people go, oh yeah, of course, because that affects us here and it affects other people around the world. So using that repetition to hammer home the point, Bush could have just said, there's no longer a distinction between foreign and domestic. Next point. You've got to think of, well, how do you really back up that point? What's the evidence? And that repetition is how he makes that point sink home. There is no longer a distinction between foreign and domestic. World, 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 world. Then the audience see it and they get it and they understand it because you've backed up that statement. And in this case, backing up the statement with the technique of repetition. There's lots of different ways to back up a statement, but this particular example works in this instance.
Our hopes, our hearts, our hands are with those on every continent.
Here's a little sentimental technique, something that we've seen so often in these presidential inauguration speeches. Actually, this was the first example I picked up on. We have the alliterative rule of three. So we're seeing the combining of two techniques. Rule of three is something that gets employed in every single speech, pretty much, never mind in presidential inauguration. And I actually haven't really seen the rule of three pop up in this particular speech until now. We've got the three concepts and we've managed to begin them with the same letters. At any time you can synergize two different techniques. Now don't do it for every single line and try and overdo it with doing a technique all of the time. But here we're just bringing attention to that moment. We've talked about this so much before. The rule of three. Three is the lowest number that we recognize as a pattern. It pulls our attention. When we hear that same sound, it pulls our attention as well. So earlier Clinton used the same sound in terms of rhyming the words to draw the attention. Now he's using the same sound, but instead at the start of the word, the h, to pull the attention. So these are both techniques you can use to create that attention spike. And if you're using both of them at the same time, you get that extra little nudge of attention as well.
Change the face of Congress, the presidency, and the political process itself. Yes, you, my fellow Americans, have forced the spring. Now,
call back. When I get asked about how do you structure a speech, structuring a speech is all about having the different parts of your speech speak to each other. And one of the ways that you do that is through the callback. So I've started using the analogy of a bridge to help people understand. So when you're trying to cross water and you build a bridge, you don't just build this like big flat bridge. You build a bridge with arches, don't you? The arches add more structural integrity to the bridge. So when you're thinking of your speeches, your arches are those loops where your speech speaks to other parts of your speeches. So you can have a loop forward where you have some kind of premonition or prediction or trailer of what's to come. So that's one part linking into something that's going to happen later in the speech. And then you have it in the other direction where you have callbacks. So you're going, this is how this part of the speech adds to, contributes to or builds on something that got said before. And one type of example is where you use that same phrase or terminology. So Clinton, right at the beginning, used this transformational idea of force the spring. And now towards the end of the speech, he's drawing back on that transformational idea of force the spring. So he's creating this callback and he's creating a structural arch of transformation in the speech. Callbacks help different parts of your speech to speak to each other. So this is an example of how now that Clinton is coming into the last few minutes of his speech, he wants those last few minutes of the speech to echo the first few minutes of the speech. Not to be the same, but to build on each other and increase the structural integrity of the entire speech.
My fellow Americans, you too must play your part in our renewal. I challenge a new generation of young Americans to a season of service, to act on your idealism by helping troubled children, keeping company with those in need, reconnecting our torn communities. There is so much to be done.
As I was listening to this speech, one of the things that I wrote down in my notes, and something that I was going to bring up in the improvement section, was there's a lot of platitudes going on here. And I wanted to have a bit more concrete practicality. So we had these big kind of phrases about change, transformation, force the spring, the Cold War, the sunshine of freedom. I'm like, okay, this is all great terminology. This is all good picture stuff. But can we bring that into something that's more specific and definite? And it was there sitting in my notes to bring back. And then Bush brought in, and then Clinton, God, I was nearly right. The president before was Bush, the president after was Bush. Clinton then brings in these specific steps. Okay, this is what you can do. This is how you jump on to this generation of change. This is how you start to break in to this summer of freedom. So you've got that big picture terminology to spark people up, to build that inspiration in them. And then as a leader, it's your job to provide direction. You tell them about the destination, the big promise, and then you've got to provide the concrete steps, the brick by brick on the yellow brick road. And that's what Clinton's managed to do here. Now he's coming to the end of his speech. If you imagine it like a funnel, where we're going big, 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 and we're starting to get more specific coming towards the end of this speech. So Clinton almost had an improvement that needed to come in there, but he saved it with this specific action, calling on people, this is what you can do if you want to be part of the change.
We have heard the trumpets. We have changed the guard. And now, each in our own way, and with God's help, we must answer the call. Thank you, and God bless you all.
That was a cute little bit there. We pointed to some examples of rhyme earlier on, and Clinton actually finished on a rhyme. So this was a little bit of a technique that fed throughout the speech. Answer the call, God bless you all. So we've got that statement of conviction, we've got the call to action, and then, okay, well, what can we do to make that memorable? Just putting in that little bit of a technique, that little bit of a rhyme, it just makes that point a little bit stickier. Because your last line lingers with your audience. If you want to look at psychological studies, there's something called the primacy and recency effect. So it's one of the first things you learn in your first year of studying psychology at school or university, is that we remember things near the beginning of an experience and near the end of an experience. The most remembered part of your speeches will be the first couple minutes and the last couple minutes. And even so much as the first and last line of those minutes. What are you going to do with that peak of attention? That's what's going to stay with your audience the most. So how do you make that the most memorable aspects of your speech? How do you ensure that what you say and what you build and what you call upon your audience to do is going to stick with them? And if it sticks with them, how are they going to implement it and take it into their lives and take it into their communities going forward? So Clinton ends on the call to action. He ends with the tone of conviction and a nice little bit of rhyme. It really just rounds off everything nicely in this speech. I shared with you in that analysis that there was a part of Clinton's speech that I almost picked up on as a point for improvement, but he managed to rally and save it later on in the speech. Well, this is the type of thing that I'm looking for in a speaker. That even when you're an accomplished speaker delivering a great speech, there are always aspects you can think of for improvement. Now, if you're looking at your speeches and you're speaking and you're thinking that you could use some adjustments and improvements as well, then I could help you with my coaching services. I've put a link to my LinkedIn in the description below. And if you send me a message on there, reach out and tell me a little bit about where your speaking's at the moment, what you're trying to do if you're speaking, and what you're trying to improve. We can look at some different options for how my coaching services can help you and your speaking going forward. Speaking of helping speeches, let's now look at Clinton's speech and what are some areas that he could work on and improve in.
And that drifting has eroded our resources, fractured our economy, and shaken our confidence. Though our challenges are fierce.
I think Clinton does a really good job in his speech of hitting the highs, getting that real energy and conviction and enthusiasm coming through. I would like to have seen him be able to dip into the lows a little bit more. So we get this bit where we're talking about some of the challenges and difficulties. And I don't think Clinton does a bad job here. I don't think he sounds like ridiculously energetic and optimistic here. And he does have a nice pause just for reflection. But I would have liked to have heard the emotion just drop in his voice a little bit more, talking about the struggles and challenges, talking about our confidence has been shaken. The difficulties have hit us hard. Being able to hit those highs and also to be able to acknowledge those lows as well, it creates more of an emotional rhythm throughout the speech. It allows you to connect where people are with their struggles and challenges and be able to lift them up into their targets and aspirations as well. So I don't think this was a poorly executed part of the speech, but I think there could be a little bit of sharpening and improvement in that particular area.
The vision and will of those who came before us.
Okay, this is something I was looking forward to talking about here. Here we see the beginning of the cliched politician's thumb. This is something I'm sure you're used to seeing all of the time now. And it was probably just coming into fashion round about this period because we haven't seen it in some of the speeches before, but we see Clinton using it now. And the idea behind the politician's thumb, it's a way to demonstrate power and conviction without looking domineering and authoritative. So the kind of pointing figure can be seen as a bit aggressive. So it's a way of softening that expression, but still getting some of that conviction in. And it's a nice thinking behind the idea. The issue is that anything that gets used as a technique quickly becomes recognized as a technique. And this is something that I really try to steer people away from when it comes to thinking about your body language in terms of your speaking. Body language is not about techniques. I have to do this facial expression or this gesture. It's about thinking about how your body language matches and complements your words. And as long as your body language is matching and complementing your words, it doesn't really matter how you're doing it. It doesn't matter the technique that you're doing it with. The issue with the politician's thumb is now everyone uses it because they think it's a technique and they need to use it. And when you're using it as a technique, it gets recognized as a technique. That's why I call it the politician's thumb. And that's why when I say the politician's thumb, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? Politicians from all sides of the political spectrum in different countries, they are using the politician's thumb. So that means once it's recognized as a technique and once everyone is using it, well, it no longer has the power anymore. So instead of trying to use body language techniques, you've got to think about how you allow your natural expressiveness to come forth and seeing body language as part of the picture rather than this is the thing that I need to do in order for the speech to work. So At the time, this was probably quite fresh and not a cliche as Clinton was using it, and people thought, oh, you know what, I like the thing that he does with his thumb. But now that everyone's doing it, no one likes it. So I think this is an important thing to focus on here, is with body language, it's not about technique, it's about picture. It's not about the single thing that you're doing, it's about the constellation of things that you do.
But for our communities and our country. To renew America, we must revitalize.
One thing I was really impressed with in Clinton speaking is how little he used notes. And I actually wrote down as I was watching the speech, it was about 4 minutes in, and I thought, is he even speaking with notes at all? I could see absolutely nothing. There was no turning of the pages, there was no reference. His eye contact was always up here on the plane. And it's only at this point in the speech, halfway through his speech, that I actually realized, okay, he does have some notes here. And at first, I've written this down as a compliment that he's not using notes, and it is a compliment. And I think it's probably the first, it is the first example where we have seen a speech that is really delivered without notes. And I think that's a huge testament to Clinton's preparation with this speech. However, I am going to pick and nitpick this particular aspect, that this was the first time I noticed he needed the notes. And I also noticed that he forgot the line as well. So it wasn't just a reference to the notes. I could just tell that he'd forgotten. And it's very slight. There's just that little bit of I know he doesn't know what he's going to say next. He looks down at the notes and he starts saying the line looking at the notes. When you're using notes, it's absolutely fine to use notes. But you want to be speaking off the notes and not speaking on the notes. So when you've got some notes there, you can use them as a point of reference, but make sure you deliver the lines to your audience. Point of reference, deliver the lines to the audience. And that was just a small slip up from Clinton. And to be honest, it's much more positive than it is negative. I'm so much happier to see him delivering this speech so much off the notes than the one little mistake that he makes when he does reference his notes. But I didn't have a lot to pick up on in this particular speech, so I'm going to nitpick that one. Overall, a fantastic example of using notes, and I'm much more pleased that he had the courage to speak off them and make a small slip up than speak on the notes and make no slip up at all.
With the conviction that America's long, heroic journey must go forever upward. And so, my fellow Americans,
remember I was just talking about body language being a constellation, about how your body language matches what you're saying. This example, the gesture here, the dreaded politician's thumb again. See when you watch this whole speech, the link to the whole speech is in the description as always. See when you watch the whole thing, and now I've picked up on watch the politician's thumb, you'll see it happening all the time. But there was this gesture. He was talking about the progress going upward, and I felt the gesture went more forward. And I just wonder if he got caught in his mind. He was like, did I want to say upward or did I want to say forward? And actually both are fine. There's nothing wrong with either. But I feel I just got a little bit of a disconnect where he had maybe practiced forward, but upward came out his mouth, or vice versa. He'd practiced upward, but in the moment he started to think forward. And so you sort of see this gesture go out, and then he kind of does this little flick at the end. And you know what? I think the reason for this is he practiced saying forward. And he had this gesture that went with it going forward. And when he realized that upward came out of his mouth, he had to, let's quickly do something with that. And this is what I mean about body language. It's not about the technique. So it's not about doing the politician's thumb. It's about, well, how does the gestures, the expressions, the movement, the posture match the words that are saying? And that was a little bit of a disconnect where the hand is doing one thing and the mouth is saying something else. That's what I mean when I'm talking about body language being holistic and matching what you're doing. So again, just a small discrepancy in the body language there. Again, something very slight, something really nitpicky. And that's all I've actually got to nitpick with this speech. There wasn't a whole lot that I could critique and criticize. I would say that this speech to me, out of all the ones we've done so far, it's the first speech that looks like a modern speech. This speech looks like something we would expect to see nowadays, whereas I think a lot of the previous speeches, they looked like they were in black and white, even when they weren't in black and white. In terms of just the style, the mannerisms, the language, they looked like speeches of the past, whereas this is starting to look more like a speech of the present in terms of the techniques that Clinton is employing, in terms of his mannerisms and the way that he's coming across. So there's lots to talk about that's great in this speech. I've just picked up on a few sharpening points there, and sometimes that's all it is when it comes to speeches, and indeed your speaking as well. It's what are those points of sharpness that you can grow and improve. For this speech, for example, probably the biggest thing that is going throughout is that notion of the politician's thumb. It's a nice technique, and it was fresh in the 90s. It won't be fresh now. So it's those little things you can pick up on and go, there's just this one little thing. I'm doing so much of my speech, my speaking right, but this one little thing can just be a little bit of annoyance and an irritation for you as a speaker sometimes, and definitely for your audience as well. And that's what going through this process of analyzing and working on speeches can help with, is cutting out those small 1% things and getting as close to that 100% target for a speech as you can.